An indestructible dome traps the people of Chester's Mill. As the world tries to figure out where it came from, journalist Julia Shumway befriends a stranger named Barbie, unaware of his involvement in her husband's disappearance. Meanwhile, Jim, the last councilman in town, tasks Reverend Lester to destroy the evidence about their suspicious propane deliveries. With that, the Reverend breaks into the recently deceased sheriff's home but accidentally sets it on fire. After 2 days of being cut off from the world, Deputy Paul opens fire on the dome, hoping to take it down. Instead, he accidentally kills his colleague, Freddy. At a gathering, teenagers Joe and Ben watch the video of Paul shooting the dome. 2 girls approach them, surprised that Joe's phone is still working, though he clarifies that he still can't get a signal. Meanwhile, Julia and Barbie rush to the police station. Julia insists on getting information from the deputies as she wants to get out of the dome immediately and find her husband, Peter. Hearing this, Barbie turns silent as he hasn't confessed to accidentally killing Peter during their fight over the man's debts to his boss. At the station, Julia quickly questions Deputy Linda about their safety, given that there are only a few officers alongside her. Instead, Jim approaches and assures her they'll be fine. Seeing Paul taken into custody, the people demand justice, but Jim stresses that the shooting was an accident, advising everyone to remain calm and return home. At the gathering, Nori asks Joe and his friends where she can charge her phone. Ben recognizes that she's not from Chester's Mill, so she clarifies that she was passing through town when the dome appeared. Joe offers to charge her phone at his house since he has a generator. When he mentions that no one else is home, Nori asks if she can stay there too. Confused, Joe asks about the lady she was with before, but Nori denies knowing them, even though they're her mothers. In his cell, Paul shouts conspiracies about the dome when he suddenly hyperventilates. Concerned, Linda opens the cell, but he knocks her down and locks her inside. He declares that the dome will make them crazy and kill them, so he runs off. The next morning, Jim questions why his son, Junior, wasn't around when the town put out the fire at the sheriff's house. He stresses how people look up to him to lead, so his son's actions can reflect on him poorly. Jim insists that Junior mustn't squander the opportunities he's given him. When he notices his bruises, Junior recounts that Barbie punched him but doesn't share that he accused the man of sleeping with his ex-girlfriend. Unconcerned, Jim advises him to toughen up. Inside their fallout shelter, Angie, Junior's ex-girlfriend and captive, listens to a broadcast about the fire. She immediately hides the radio when Junior arrives with her breakfast. Seeing her angry, Junior explains that the dome's causing her to act differently, blaming it for her breaking up with him. Angie argues that he's the one acting differently since he locked her up. Junior dismisses it and says everything will return to normal once they get out of the dome. Angie asks if anyone has gone through the cement factory tunnels to see if the dome ends under it. She recounts how they went there for some privacy, hoping he'll take her there. However, Junior goes alone. At the hospital, Jim scolds Lester for burning the house. He points out they're the only ones who know about their business, so it's best to keep it that way. Meanwhile, Julia asks why Barbie's in Chester's Mill, but he deflects that she asks questions to avoid being asked. He wonders why such an ambitious journalist is in town, so Julia recounts that Peter grew up there, so when circumstances changed, they moved there to start over. Julia then notices radio broadcaster Phil, but before she approaches him, Barbie excuses himself to leave. At the station, Jim frees Linda, scolding her for being careless. Knowing that Paul escaped, Jim plans to organize a search party. Linda then discovers Paul took their firearms, so she heads to Black Ridge Woods, where he often hunts. Jim stops her, but the deputy clarifies he doesn't control her. At the inn, Nori's mother, Carolyn, asks around for her missing daughter, worried she may experience another seizure. She shows a family photo to Roger and Ollie to check if they've seen Nori, but seeing that the girl has 2 mothers, Ollie provokes her. After announcing a news update with Phil, Julia notices Junior outside, so she approaches him. She sees the gear he's carrying, so she wonders where he's going, but he refuses to answer and walks away. At the inn, Jim announces that Paul has escaped, so he asks for volunteers for the search party. Roger and Ollie volunteer. Then Jim introduces himself to Barbie and notices his bruised knuckles, confirming Junior's story. Since Paul's an experienced soldier, he asks Barbie to join the search, given how he took the deputy down during the shooting. The men soon arrive at the forest, where Jim leads the way. However, Barbie thinks they're following a dummy trail. Seeing broken branches on the opposite side, they head there instead. On another side of the forest, Linda also searches for Paul. While following the trail, Jim wonders if Barbie's a soldier, but the latter denies it. Suddenly, Roger finds Paul, so he hides behind the tree. Still, Paul hears him and shoots Roger's leg before escaping. While Ollie sends Roger to the hospital, Jim and Barbie pursue Paul. When asked if they'll kill or make him surrender, Jim asks if it makes a difference to him. Barbie wonders what he means, but the man urges him to continue. At Joe's home, Ben arrives with 2 girls who want to use his friend's generator. Joe asks if Ben mentioned his generator to others, which the guy doesn't deny. At the same time, Junior goes inside the cement factory tunnel, unaware that Julia Julia's following him. After going deeper into the tunnels, he discovers that the dome extends underground. He touches the dome, then drops his shaking flashlight. Julia stops him from picking it up just before the flashlight explodes. Jim glares at the woman, questioning why she followed him. Julia claims that she thought he'd find a way out. Frustrated, Junior repeatedly punches the dome, screaming at it. He panics as the tunnel is like a maze, so finding the exit will be difficult without his flashlight. Having learned it from coal miners, Julia suggests following the airflow, which the flames from her matches would show. The two make their way, but Junior starts feeling hopeless. He shares how his father pressures him to be like him, but he constantly fails. Julia comments that they all screw up, sharing how she ruined her career by publishing an article containing false information. Still, she learned from the mistake and urges him to keep going. Meanwhile, teenagers arrive at Joe's house to charge their devices. Frustrated, he plans to ask them to leave, but Carter, who used to date Joe's sister, Angie, arrives, thanking him for inviting them. Soon, Carter starts charging people for using Joe's generator, so Nori tells him to leave. Pissed, he grabs Nori's arm, and Joe defends her, demanding Carter to get out. Suddenly, the generator overloads and the power goes out, so everyone leaves. While Julia and Junior head out, she suspects that the dome occurred because of Barbie, calling him a psychopath for attacking him. He shows his bruises, making Julia wonder about Barbie's behavior. At that moment, they find the exit. In the forest, Barbie wonders if the councilman wants recognition, so Jim recalls when a showboater called him Big Jim as a joke when he was on the football team. During practice, he taunted Jim, so he shattered the guy's pelvis. Since then, Big Jim wasn't a joke anymore, so he stresses that an example must be made to get respect. Suddenly, Paul sneaks behind Jim, holding the councilman at gunpoint. Barbie aims his gun at the deputy, but instead, Linda shoots Paul. That night, Jim, Barbie, and Linda bring Paul's body to Lester. Afterward, the councilman apologizes to Linda for doubting her capabilities, so he appoints her as the new sheriff. On their way home, Junior asks Julia to keep what happened in the tunnel a secret, so she agrees. Junior soon arrives at their house, seeing Jim with Barbie. He glares at the man, so Barbie decides to leave with Julia. Curious, she asks Barbie what happened, but he claims it's a long story. Inside, Jim pours Junior a glass of milk and asks what he did. His son admits going into the tunnels to find a way out, but there's none. Junior then asks what he's doing with Barbie, but his father says he should let the adults do their job. He orders his son to drink his milk, but when he leaves, Junior pours it down the drain. Meanwhile, Joe attempts to fix the generator with Nori when Carolyn barges into his house. Confused, Joe asks who she is, so Nori admits that Carolyn is one of her mothers. She then thanks Joe for standing up for her and touches his hand. Electricity sparks between the two, causing them to have a seizure while repeating the phrase, "Pink stars are falling in lines." At the shelter, Junior brings a medical kit to let Angie clean his wound, sharing that there was no way out in the tunnels. As Angie prepares to treat Junior, she hides a pair of scissors. That night, Julia notices Barbie's bruised knuckles and his map. When he goes to shower, Julia takes his map and sees an address marked on it. The next day, a crowd gathers, protesting as the military outside the dome is leaving. Linda demands them to disperse, taking her gun to warn them off. Before things escalate, Lester preaches, claiming that they've lived wickedly, so they must bend to God's will. Having had enough, Jim exits his car and orders the people to return home. Ollie argues that the government has abandoned them, but Jim points out he's still with them. Shortly after, Linda collapses. Inside the shelter, Junior brings Angie her prom dress. Pretending to feel romantic, she asks him to turn around so she can get dressed. Instead, she grabs the scissors and attacks Junior, but he overpowers her. Wounded, he tightens her restraints as Angie apologizes. Knowing she was just pretending, he dismisses her pleas, promising she'll leave whenever she's ready. Soon, Julia arrives at the address on the map, where she sees Peter's car. However, a neighbor claims it's Phil's car, so she questions him about it. Phil claims Peter sold it to him. Then he collapses, so Julia calls for help. Meanwhile, Carolyn and her wife, Alice, want Nori and Joe to be checked for their seizures. However, Nurse Adams reveals they have no MRI equipment and are understaffed. Given this, Alice volunteers as she's a psychiatrist who interned in medicine. During this, Joe notices Junior getting his wounded hand cleaned. He asks him if he's seen Angie, but Junior claims he hasn't. Shortly after, Jim and Barbie arrive with Linda. Junior sees his father, so he explains that he got wounded by chopping wood. Julia also arrives with Phil, realizing that Linda also collapsed like him. Meanwhile, Angie discovers an air vent, so she grabs hold of a pipe and screams for help. However, the pipe breaks and Angie falls, getting knocked out as water pours into the shelter. At the hospital, Alice tests Nori and Joe to figure out what caused their seizures. However, Jim calls her as more patients arrive. In the hallway, Julia approaches Barbie and mentions that she brought in his friend Phil. She questions how he knows Phil and why he has a map. Julia insists that he owes her, given that she let him into her house, but Barbie walks walks away. Julia suddenly feels weak, so Alice gets her treated. Meanwhile, Linda recognizes her elementary teacher, Mrs. Moore, who's also sick. Alice thinks there's an outbreak of meningitis, but they don't have enough antibiotics. Luckily, Jim, Barbie, and Junior were vaccinated, as well as Alice's family, but the disease could spread within the dome. To prevent this, Jim hands Junior his gun, ordering him to ensure that nobody leaves the hospital. In the shelter, Angie wakes up, realizing that it's flooding. She attempts to fix the pipe, but to no avail. Scared, Angie screams for help. During this, Jim and Barbie head to the pharmacy to get antibiotics, but it's been ransacked. Barbie suspects whoever stole the medicine must have driven a truck since they stole a lot. Jim then realizes that Lester might have done it using his hearse. In the hospital, Julia asks Phil how he got Peter's car, but he babbles about the cabin. Meanwhile, Carolyn grows concerned over Alice, who's working hard. She assures her wife that they're safe as they got vaccinated and adds that she took her insulin without eating. Hearing this, Carolyn goes to get her food. Alice then discovers that Linda's and Moore's fevers have risen. With only one dose of antibiotics left, Moore insists on giving it to Linda. Alice respects her decision, so they give the dose to Linda, leaving Moore teary-eyed. At the door, Julia demands Junior to let her out, but he refuses. She explains that her husband might be in trouble in a cabin, and hearing this reminds Junior of the cabin where he and Barbie fought. He shares the address but doesn't let her out, so Julia steals Peter's card from his office to escape through the back door. Jim and Barbie soon arrive at Lester's house, where they find him attempting to burn the medicines. Lester claims the people are supposed to die as it's his plan, but Jim takes the medicine while Barbie shoves Lester. Soon, Linda wakes up, and Moore tells her that she was given antibiotics. The teacher shares how Linda has changed from the naughty student she used to be. Linda gives credit to people who helped her, like the deceased sheriff. Moore advises her not to underestimate herself just before she flatlines. The people soon demand to leave, so Junior fires a warning shot just as Linda arrives at the lobby. Seeing her, he's reminded of his duty, so he reminds everyone that they're all neighbors and they have to fight this challenge together. He believes that his father and the citizens can handle the situation, so he puts the gun down and leaves. Despite the door open for them, the people choose to stay. Meanwhile, Julia arrives at the cabin and discovers Peter's documents. As she processes what it means, she suddenly collapses and hallucinates seeing her husband. In their hospital room, Nori wants her and Joe to trigger another seizure to figure out why it's happening. Joe suggests filming themselves while at it, so they set up the camera, hold hands, and instantly collapse on the floor. At the same time, Jim and Barbie arrive at the hospital with the antibiotics. Barbie then asks Phil about Julia's whereabouts, but he doesn't know where she is. Demanding what Phil told her, he kicks his wheelchair out of annoyance. Afraid, Phil assumes that Peter owes Barbie money, so he claims that the doctor skipped town already. A month ago, Peter asked Phil if he knew any hitmen, so he thought his friend was in trouble. He adds that after he bought Peter's car, he advised him to get out of Chester's Mill to escape his debts. Curious, Barbie asks Phil if he told Julia, but he can't remember. Meanwhile, Nori and Joe regain consciousness and check the video. They discover that they said pink stars are falling in lines just before Joe hushed the camera. He doesn't remember doing it, but thinks the dome doesn't want them to tell anyone about what they discovered. Soon, Barbie discovers from Junior that Julia went to the cabin. Concerned, Barbie commands Junior to give him his car keys, but he refuses. He points out that Julia escaped under his watch, so he's to blame if something happens to her. Guilty, Junior hands him the keys. He eventually arrives at the cabin, where he finds Julia, so he takes her back to the hospital. At the fallout shelter, Angie shivers from the cold as the water floods the room. That night at the hospital, Linda tells Jim that Junior led the people, stopping them from rioting. Hearing this, Jim asks Junior if he's considering law enforcement as a career, making Junior smile. When Julia wakes up, she demands answers from Barbie. Finally, he confesses that he's an enforcer and Peter had a gambling debt. Julia believes Peter never gambled, so Barbie plays Peter's voicemail to him, where he claimed to have the money to pay him. Distressed, Julia asks where Peter is, so Barbie lies that he left town. Upset, she demands Barbie to leave her house. At the same time, Joe offers Nori's family to stay at his house since his parents are outside the dome. Alice agrees, so Carolyn grabs their things, even stealing insulin for her partner, as she only has a few left. When Alice catches her, Carolyn admits that she's scared that the dome will last forever. Alice then assures her they'll get out, so they return the insulin. Meanwhile, Barbie leaves Julia's house, feeling guilty as he glances at the couple's photo one last time. At the police station, Junior assures Linda that it's not her fault that Mrs. Moore sacrificed her life. He believes the lady knows how important Linda is in the town. Still, Linda thinks she's to blame. She then congratulates Junior for saving lives by keeping the quarantine at peace. Recognizing his actions, she hands him a badge, making him her deputy. At the same time, Jim returns home and finds Lester handing over his share of their profits, disassociating himself from their business. The Reverend asserts that his actions didn't save this town, but instead, he damned them by defying his will. Pissed, Jim wonders about arresting him for stealing the medicines. Lester just reminds him that Jim can't hurt him without hurting himself. As the shelter gets flooded, Angie continues screaming into the vent. Finally, Jim is in the kitchen to hear her, so he goes to the fallout shelter, where he discovers the flood. He opens the door and sees Angie, finally realizing what his son is capable of.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.